So, this evening, actually for the second time, we have Miss Jodell Onstott. Welcome.
Shalom. Great to be with you.
I have to inform everyone that this is actually our second discussion. Our first discussion didn't get recorded. I'm not sure what happened, but I'll try to make this one even more entertaining than the first one. So, Miss Onstott wrote a book called Yud Hey Wah Hey Exists. Can you tell me a little bit about that book?
Yes, the book, and first of all, let me just clarify, it is Mrs. I am married.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That is fine. So my book is Yehovah Exists. It culminated 16 years of in-depth research. I primarily relied on atheist scholars because I figured that if I could find in their arguments, their lines of reasoning, support for the Hebrew text, that then perhaps, I could find credible evidence there. And that's exactly what I did. So by working through academic scholarship, I delved into the validity of the Torah, its commands for dietary laws, prohibitions for certain things. And then I dealt into historicity, the Exodus, as well as prophecy and a lot of different other ideas to see if they held valid. What makes the Hebrew faith, a Tanakh-based faith, different from all the other religions out there. And what I came away with was the fact that the biblical text is indeed valid.
Have you gotten a backlash from the Orthodox community? Because, at least in the Orthodox world that I come from, people don't like hearing anything or learning anything from people who are not religious themselves. How do you feel about that?
By and large, I will say everyone has been very gracious and kind and very accepting. I do have those in the Orthodox that have said, thank you so much. This, parallels what I've studied. But then I do have those, especially because I do use the divine name. And, I will say some of those people have gotten downright ugly. And it's not exactly the love your neighbor as yourself motive here. It's, just a lot of vitriol. But I take it in stride because most of the people that I come in contact with, they are very sincere. They are searching. They're very pure of heart. They want to know God. They want to walk in His ways, and they are seeking Him and, using whatever resources they can find.
Mm-hmm. When I said secular, I didn't mean that you were secular, but I mean that you draw from secular sources. I know in the Orthodox world they have an issue from learning anything, let's say, from someone they don't consider Jewish, halakhically Jewish. I remember once I donated a set of Humashim, of books of the Torah, to a synagogue, and they refused it because it had some commentary within it by non-Jews. This is like a famous thing that happened with the Sensino or the Hertz edition of the Humash, that very Orthodox synagogues would not have it in because they considered it tainted. I didn't mean to say that you are in any way irreligious. I mean, you yourself consider yourself a religious person, correct?
Oh, very definitely. I do. And I really haven't found that ideology or that point of view with the people that I come in contact with. Most of those within the Orthodox community or the spectrum of Jewish communities, because there's some reform in there as well. But everyone that I come in contact with is very open to an academic interpretation or approach. Now, I do not exclude religious points of view either. I also appeal to Hertz, and I appeal to other Jewish scholars as well, but I'm certainly not exclusive.
What distinction did you make in your book between the 5 books of Moses and everything else?
So the 5 books of Moses, I find that as foundational. It is the groundwork, and in a modern sense, it is very much a constitution. So today for America, the U.S. Constitution determines our direction, determines how we apply our laws, what laws can be applied, defines the limits and extents of government. I find that the ancient Torah actually did the exact same thing. People aren't always aware of the fact that there was actually a division of power within the ancient Israelite law code, where you had a division between the priesthood, between leaders, between the Adah and the Kahal, and all of these things functioned to preserve liberty. In Leviticus 25, you have this idea of proclaiming liberty throughout the land, and that really is the foundational concept of Torah, and Torah tells us how to preserve that delicate balance of government, the will of the people between man and his brother, and to have a very robust functioning society where there is peace, harmony, and growth, but yet at the same time we do not oppress each other.
How do you view books outside of the Torah, the writings and the prophets?
I see those as interpreters of the Torah. So if Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin were to have written books outside of the U.S. Constitution, those are great reference books for understanding how a particular founding father intended the Constitution to be understood. Same thing with the prophets. Even though sometimes they were separated by 1,000 years, I find that they do have a valid viewpoint and a valid interpretation for applying the law into everyday real-world situations.
Mm-hmm. That verse about proclaiming liberty that appears in Leviticus, it seems that it's really a liberty under the auspices of a court. Do you think this court in adjudicating Israel would have used any other book other than the laws that are found within the 5 books of Moses?
Well, it depends what time period. As far as law, they would have used definitely the Torah. That would have been their foundation. But there was also a distinction, because you do have different courts of law. You have the Adah, which was one governing body, but then you also had a separate court within the Levites as well. Mm-hmm. In my book, I compare them to a civil court and to a federal court, where if you could not find satisfaction within the civil court, then it could be appealed, up the branches until you came to the Levitical courts all the way to the high priest.
Mm-hmm. In Hebrew, we call that Beit Din Ketana versus the Beit Din Hagadol, the smaller court and the larger court. Although every tribe had their own court. Sanhedrin just means court. But the reason I mention it is because many people nowadays build doctrine and consider also as source material books outside of the 5 books of Moses. Now, that's kind of hard to accept when not even the elders would have adjudicated someone against a statement found in Isaiah or in Ezekiel. It seems nowadays that we judge from books that weren't considered source material back then.
Right. Yeah, the Torah is the foundation. Again, I see it as a constitution. Daniel Elazar, whose work I very much am grateful for. He has the site, it's Jerusalem Center for Public Policy. And he goes through and shows how Deuteronomy really fits the idea of a modern constitution. So if you use that constitution as the basis for any adjudication, for any, sentences that are going to be offered in court, you really can't err from that. And I think that one of the ways in which the Torah excels the U.S. Constitution is that it gives you circumstances. So it says, in this situation, this is how you should judge, or in this situation. So it gives you 3 to 4 different case studies, kind of a case law that you can set precedent, whereby you can take that and extrapolate it and apply it to other cases. That's not going outside of it. It's, within the confines of the written Torah. One of the problems that we have in America with our modern tort system is the fact that we allow this ever-evolving set of precedent that just continually balloons. It's contradictory. And one case in Nevada may contradict a case in Georgia, but yet you can still appeal to those, at least in federal courts, with whatever case that you're arguing, rather than always going back to some foundational document where you are held accountable to whatever bizarre ruling you're going to have that keeps, everything sane. Like, for instance, and I don't have the guy's name, but the Islamist who recently shot up this synagogue, and I think it was the Jewish community in New York, he pleaded insanity, and now he's not even going to serve time. And this was like within the last 2 weeks. Things like that. The Torah would hold those types of judgments accountable, where we can't go just so far off into left field where we have no semblance of justice in the land.
Mm-hmm. Departing a little bit from the Torah, this consensus, this ruling body that began in the Torah, do you see it have any authority in books outside of the Torah?
Clarify your question just a little bit more.
For example, the notion of the Great Court seems to have existed all the way from when Moses was told by God to gather 70 elders, 71 with himself, that God was going to put on them what he put on him. And also Moses transferring authority to Yehoshua, and on. There seems to have been a judicial consensus that traveled amongst Israel till they landed in Jerusalem. And even while in Jerusalem, on top of the Temple Mount, there was a court. In your book, do you emphasize the authority of this ruling body even after the closing of the Torah?
I mentioned the fact that you had two different governing bodies, that, again, it was a balance of power. You had the Levites. Eventually, of course, you had the monarchy, and then you had the Adal and the Kahal. The Kahal was really, as you say, the lesser court, where everyone had a voice and everyone could, enter a petition. The elders, as far as that, what you find is that and it's actually fascinating. In Exodus 18, it's Yithro who comes to Moses and says, you take too much upon you, you need to divide. So it's not even Yahovah eventually who says, Moses, you need to divide, you need to, put elders. It's actually, his father-in-law who tells him to divide the labor, to distribute it among, make judges, and to teach them how to judge righteously. And then, of course, the elders are indeed sanctified in that position. And, yeah, you do find that these ruling houses, and again, elders are often, sometimes it says elders, sometimes it will also say the Nazi, and the Nazi were the 70 ruling households in the land. So, that particular position indeed was valid. It existed at least until the destruction of the first temple, and then it came back. We are told that not all the families came back. So exactly what families that consisted of, even if you appeal to the Mishnah or you appeal to other books, we are still not told exactly, who the 70 families were that made up that governing body.
This notion of 70 families, is that mentioned in the Torah?
It is. The 70 elders, sometimes they're called elders, sometimes they're called Nazi, and the Nazi would then be the princes of each tribe, or the major clans within Israel, when you look at it in the Hebrew.
Deuteronomy chapter 1 does reiterate the statement uttered by Yitro that Moses should make princes to help him adjudicate the Jewish people. And this is later reiterated in Numbers 22 and Deuteronomy chapter 17, but nowhere does it ever tied into families, i.e. having some sort of transferred authority. As a matter of fact, Deuteronomy chapter 17 talks about the priest, the Levites, and the judges. We even see that we have a book called Shoftim, that these judges existed, but not necessarily from a particular family, unless that particular family is the family of Aaron, because the high priest, at least historically, was always the Nasi, till, at least according to Josephus and even some sources in the Talmud, that the whole priesthood became corrupted, and then a non-Levite had to step into the ultimate ruling authority of the house of judges. But I never heard from a Jewish perspective that there was a lineage going back to 40 families. I just don't see it.
Or 70.
I'm sorry? Or 70,
well,
right.
Right. The question is, were the elders synonymous with the judges? And then, whatever role they played probably would have been augmented during the monarchy period. We do have some archaeological evidence that dates to the time of Jehu, where it talks about, in this, I forgot the settlement that this was excavated in, but it is a command that very much coincides with the Torah, and it says, you shall seek justice, you shall judge wisely. It talks about instilling judges in the land. So you do find those concepts reiterated and held up within Israel's monarchy.
Mm-hmm. So from an Orthodox perspective, Orthodox Jews view the individuals that appear in the Mishnah, not the writers of the Mishnah or the compiler of the Mishnah, but much, much earlier, people like Rabbi Akiva, they consider them as judges claiming to have a line going all the way back to Moses through a process called smicha, which is ordination. Now, clearly that's a statement of faith. Would love for it to be verified in other places, although it is verified in Josephus, and I think perhaps in Philo-Judaeus, but outside of that, there just isn't much in that realm outside of the religious circle. But the notion of consensus and there being a standard for Israel to progress in a uniform manner had to be there. Because what we do know is that the Jewish people never walked around as a people interpreting the Torah for themselves individually. That there had to be a consensus how these things were done, especially when there was a death penalty attached to many of these ceremonial laws. I'm not of the opinion that the whole body of rabbinic literature was given on Mount Sinai, like many mystics believe, but I believe that there was a consensus, and this body of elders existed all through the Jewish people. Even with the return of Ezra, the men of the Great Assembly were part of this group. They just went by different names, from the court, the elders, the men of the Great Assembly, to ultimately the Sanhedrin. But Sanhedrin, like I said, just means court. Every tribe had their own court. How do you feel about the notion that the Torah was never studied back then from an individual perspective like it's being studied today?
Right. The main issue comes to the fact that very early on, the access to the Torah. You find in Deuteronomy 7, one of the reasons why you are commanded to read the Torah Deuteronomy 30, you're commanded to read the Torah every 7 years is because the nation itself, it assumes the nation itself did not have a Torah. Not every family had one. So you don't find that really late in the monarchy that the writing becomes very dispersed. And then it's late in the monarchy where you find that there's this written scribalship, and parts of scripture are quoted, or you find that there is definitely a knowledge within the writings that you find in inscriptions. So, but very early on, families and individuals would not have had individual access. It definitely would have been in a community setting. And that's probably one of the reasons why Torah says, you shall have a weekly Shabbat and a holy convocation on that day where you would meet with the Levites, and there would be a dissemination of information. There would be a teaching, making sure the community walked in the way of Yahovah. Mm-hmm. So I definitely find that's very valid, because we take a lot of times we take all of our modern inventions for granted, and the dissemination of books is something that is a very modern process.
Mm-hmm. I feel that is true regarding the books of the writings and the prophets, but not the 5 books of Moses, because there's an actual command for every Israelite to write a Torah scroll for himself. Or not necessarily the 5 books as we have them today, but whatever they would have considered the book of the law. And the yearly practice that in Hebrew they call hakel, but the Torah doesn't say the king has to read it, but some leader has to read it. It seems that's tied very much to the notion of the Haggadah nowadays, that if you don't read a story and remind your children in the collective of what we went through, we'll lose the meaning behind it. But not that people didn't have Torah scrolls available, unless people were breaking commands from day one. Even kings had a command to write 2 Torah scrolls. Again, 2 books of the law. I'm pretty sure they didn't contain what we consider Genesis nowadays and a lot of the legends, but at least what we consider judicial. Mainly so that we wouldn't come to break this law, because it would be hard to adjudicate someone against a law that they didn't know existed or didn't know well enough to be found guilty of breaking.
Right. Yeah, no, they would have, well, if they were meeting every Sabbath, every Shabbat, if they were meeting, they were being taught every Shabbat, they would know the law. I would think that, I mean, the law only really consists of, and I'm still working through it. I have a book that I'm working on. It's called the Torah Restored, where I take just the instructions, just the laws itself, and kind of weed out the history and the narrative. And it really comes across as an actual constitutional document. And when you go through that, there's only, really about 40 laws that actually apply to the community on an everyday basis. The part for the Levites and those instructions, well, that wouldn't really be something that would concern, someone who's a farmer or someone, who's tending grapes. So there really wasn't a whole lot to learn. There wasn't a whole lot to really keep straight. So I'm not discounting the fact that very early on they could have had a written document, but whether it was written or whether it was taught by the Levites early on, they had a government in place that would make sure that their society was very well educated and very much had an understanding. Again, it wasn't difficult. It was really pretty easy.
Mm-hmm. Be that you teach God's Torah, do you also identify with God's people, Israel?
Yes, absolutely. I identify, what I tell people is, if you would have taken King David or say the prophet Isaiah and say you lived during that time, our family, our household definitely would have been in that camp that would have believed like them. So sometimes I'll say that I am a Torah observant Israelite. Other times I'll say a Hebrew. But then other times I don't necessarily like names and labels, simply because the moment you put a name to yourself, all of a sudden it becomes us and them. And it seems to kind of divide. So in many ways, I'm also waiting for the day that, there are many, many promises of Yahweh returning again to Israel and him doing all these things, giving a law again. And when that occurs, he talks about giving a new name. So I think eventually we'll come full circle and, there will be a name that will unite us all rather than divide us into the different sects that we have today.
Mm-hmm. Unite us meaning Jews or us meaning humanity?
I believe it will be Israelites, and within the term of Israelites, I see it being both Jews as well as what I would consider the dispersed 10 tribes.
That's what I meant. I'm sorry.
Yes, the all 12 tribes. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, eventually the entire world. I mean, I think that this whole entire Wuhan virus is a great example as to the whole entire world's need to follow Torah, because when one nation does not, it can affect a whole entire society.
Mm-hmm. Being a student and teacher of Torah, do you feel an urge to spread the teachings of the Torah to people who happen not to believe in Torah or the God of Israel?
I love the Torah. I have fallen in love with it. It is my heart, and I share it to whoever, it has that love. I'm very careful not to push, I don't like pushing an agenda. I very much compare it to what I would call the red pill. Not everybody wants to see, and I know for myself, walking away from family. And it wasn't an intentional walk away. It was just, as Amos says, it's hard for two to walk together unless you're agreed. I have many, many dear close friends that we have either a religious difference or we have a political difference. And I can be close to them to a certain point, but it's never that unity that King David talks about, where he says how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell in unity. There is, when you have that sense of unity, that sense of community, that sense of oneness, it's very empowering and it's very motivating and very fulfilling. So I very much share the Torah. I share it with all those, who are willing, but I'm also careful not to push as well.
What are your views of an afterlife?
I would honestly say conflicted. I see texts within the Tanakh that can very much support an afterlife. From a historical side, I know that the belief in an afterlife was very, very late and wasn't even in most circles, even outside of Judaism. It was around 200 BCE that discussion really became one that was even touched upon. So one of the things that occurred during the Second Temple period was the Ptolemies. There was always these fighting factions between the Ptolemies and Syria. And one thing that Ptolemy did is he put a cult to, I believe it was Serapis, it wasn't in Jerusalem proper, but it was in Judea. And one of the Serapis cult, the whole entire ideology of that was this universal deity that kind of took the place of all these other gods and kind of absorbed everything into one. And you find that with that cult, this attention on an afterlife began to become increasingly important. More and more people who believed in the Torah and the Tanakh were put on the hot spot for, we have an afterlife, and they felt like they had to either have an answer for that or they had to have a hope in that. Mm-hmm. So all of those things give me pause. But at the same time, I do see quite a bit in the Torah in the Tanakh that could support it.
I subscribe to that ideology. I don't think the Torah or Tanakh speak of an afterlife, although there are hints here and there. I personally do believe in an afterlife, but I think that the Torah doesn't expect me or require me to believe in it. I feel that if God's a good God, those who are evil in this life, who don't get what they deserve, if there's divine justice, as God is just, they will get it in some afterlife, and that also goes for those who are righteous. But that's a personal belief. I don't believe that God requires you to believe it. It seems like God wants us to be more preoccupied with this world than the next. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that is why we are where we are right now with our current state of affairs, is that so many people focus their whole entire energy and their whole entire religion on some hereafter that's always put off to the next generation, that they never recognize the good that they can do right here, right now. And that is something that I think has plagued us for centuries. So yeah, I think that my point of view is very much in line with yours, and that I would say the majority of my beliefs do indeed hold to the fact that there is an afterlife, but I don't necessarily justify it from the Tanakh, but more on the ideas of a righteous and just God. But with the caveat that I realize it was still a discussion that was of a very late development.
Mm-hmm. In the Jewish world, we view conversion to Judaism as a public declaration, a public statement made in front of the Jewish people that you are halakhically, i.e. legally, entering the Jewish people. How do you view conversion to Judaism?
I see that as a valid option for a lot of people. I know a lot of my friends have taken the Jewish route. They have converted, most of them Orthodox, a few Reform, but most have gone Orthodox. And most of them have found a community. They have, gone through the process. They've studied with a rabbi, and they've done all that. And I think that is fantastic if that works for them. I have other people that have gone through the process, and then they become very disillusioned over the years, either by not feeling like they're accepted or just different other issues that come along the way as their studies increase and they learn and grow. As far as the biblical paradigm, I find the biblical paradigm was very, very simple. It was, you commit to loving Yahweh, to walking in his ways, and you kept the Passover, If you had males, they were circumcised. So there wasn't really this onerous requirements. It was a pretty easy process. But as far as a modern, context, I do see that there's more than one road. For myself, I attend a group that's called United Israel World Union, and that's a spot where I find community, I find incredible friendships, incredible discussions, and that's kind of where I've found my home.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the greatest obstacle keeping people from experiencing God in his fullest?
I would say putting barriers between you and God. So one of the things that I have found that is so inspiring and is so amazing, it makes God come so alive. And that is the fact that after 4,000 years after Mount Sinai, we still have the voice of God. So everybody talks about, I want, especially if you come more from the Christian perspective of, I want a relationship with God, which I understand that has a whole nother discussion, but very much finding this fulfillment in the text or a fulfillment with God. And when you when you open up your Tanakh and you read in there and it says, thus says Yahovah, you are reading what God actually says. You're reading his desires, both past, present, and future. And so I find that when you return to that and you allow that to inspire you, rather than saying, well, let me go see what this person has to say, or let me go see what that person has to say. I find that can be a real distraction. Going back, there's no substitution for the original. Like today I may listen to a constitutional lawyer on the United States Constitution, and that's great. I learn a lot from it, but I'm not going to learn as much as if I read the Constitution of the United States for myself, and I find the same thing with Torah.
I think this discussion was almost as good as our previous one. Can you tell everyone listening your website and how they can contact you?
Sure. So my website is the Tetragrammaton. It's yhwhexists.com. There's also JodellOnstott.com, which is my blog. I'm not quite as active there. My book is on Amazon. You can look for it by the title name. It will pop right up. And I am also on Facebook. I'm on Facebook by my name, Jodell Onstott, and I am also my Facebook page, which is Yahweh Exists. And we do have a book club that meets once a week. If you're interested in joining it. This week we are going over the concept of sins of the fathers and the character of God, where he visits the iniquity on the third and fourth generation. Mm-hmm. So if those types of discussions interest you, please join us.
Thank you for taking the time again to speak to my audience.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very honored and grateful to be able to talk with you.
Okay. Thank you.